You are Locked On Lakers, your daily Los Angeles Lakers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Locked On Lakers for Thursday. Brian Kamenetsky and Andy Kamenetsky. Really excited about today's episode. As we know, the finals are over, which means it's time for trades and free agency season, Andy, which means
irresponsible season. I love it.
That's right. We call it Lakers entitlement season. That's right. Lakers exceptionalism, all of those things. It begins now because
we're taking all your players season.
That's
there ain't
right.
a damn thing you can do about it season.
Dame for re-signed Markieff Morris. Let's do it. It's all on. Want to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by the live NBA draft show here at the Locked On Network. NBA draft GOAT Chad Ford, Locked On NBA draft host Rafael Barlow, and Locked On NBA host John Corrales will be live this year covering the draft on the 29th. Again, it's the Locked On NBA Draft 2021 brought to you by Built Bar. Get local expert analysis on each pick. Follow Locked On NBA on YouTube today and watch our live coverage on the 29th at 7. Now, Andy and I, as people know, aren't necessarily very smart when it comes to math. So we find people who are, because to understand what the Lakers might do as free agency approaches, you have to kind of know the rules and the landscape. Nobody does that better than our guest today, Danny Leroux. He is the salary cap and NBA guru at the Athletic. He hosts the Dunked On podcast with Nate Duncan, and he's also the host of Real GM Radio. The last two of those you can find wherever you get your podcast. Danny, so thanks so much for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So as we mentioned, this is the time of year where the Lakers can have whatever they want because we are the Lakers and that's how the world works. It's the natural order of things.
But we want to know specifically how that happens. Like, you know, the machinations and the cap math that ultimately allows the Lakers to run roughshod.
Right.
Over
is it
the
Adam
league.
Silver or Rob Pelinka who does the Obi-Wan Kenobi fingers and just does the Jedi mind tricks on people to get them what they need?
I mean, both. I mean, it's, but I think the Lakers. It's interesting when you think about it because the NBA. I think the Lakers benefit as much as anybody from the flexibility of the structure. The NBA does not use what is called a hard cap. Like you could think of the NFL, I believe, uses a version of that where it's you have this line, you can't spend over that. The NBA uses what's called a soft cap, and what that means is there is a line, and that's cap space versus not cap space. But then there are exceptions, and those exceptions include retaining your own players. They include the mid-level exception, depending on what level you are. And so those, if a team is willing to spend, and hopefully we'll cross that bridge. If a team is willing to spend, they have more latitude than they do in some other leagues. And theoretically, a team that's willing to spend, like the Lakers should be, they can do more with that than others.
So, like, looking at it, because we want to get into some of the mechanics, particularly we get a lot of questions about sign and trades and things like that, and you can explain this stuff better than we can. So broadly, and we'll get to some of that, but like broadly speaking, where do the Lakers stand heading into free agency? How much flexibility do they have? What can they do? What can't they likely do?
So I think there are two big points to kind of lay out for the Lakers. So one is the idea of kind of cap space versus the tax. So the Lakers, this is what happens when you pay LeBron James $41.2 million, you pay Anthony Davis $35.4. You're probably not going to have cap space. And so if everybody left, if you cleared the decks other than the guys that they have under contract, guaranteed contracts, the Lakers would be actually roughly at the salary cap line. And so what that means is in order to actually clear salary cap space, it's kind of difficult. So that means that, you'd be trading guys that are under contract. You'd be maybe waiving and stretching, something like that. Possible, but difficult. Instead, what the Lakers will more likely do is function as an over-the-cap team, and that allows them to do a couple of different things. They can use one of the mid-level exceptions. I'll explain that later. That allows them to retain their own players, and as you mentioned, sign and trades. I'll get into that in a little bit. Do that through sign and trades. So the Lakers, it doesn't seem like they're going to have $30 million to just get whoever they want. They don't have to deal with anybody else. Just sign them outright. But that's okay, not only because there are other ways to take out talent, but also because this year's class doesn't really have those players. Yeah, sure, if you could add Kyle Lowry for nothing or Mike Conley for nothing, great, more power to you. But it isn't that type of class. This isn't, there aren't that many super mega stars, and there aren't that many that are on the younger side. Not that the Lakers have to go that way when your best player is 36 turning 37. You don't know how long the window is going to be. But the Lakers are, I would say, the operating assumption should be that they will function as an over-the-cap team.
With that in mind, too, can you break down specifically how the Lakers cap affects what they can do, can't do with sign and trades, whether who they're bringing in, sending out because of luxury tax, cap apron, triggers, all that. And, it's complicated to understand. It can get granular, but the Lakers are a team that you're already seeing in silly season getting linked to a lot of different sign and trade scenarios. And at least in our understanding, it may not be that simple.
It is not. And so the thing to remember, and it's funny because I live geographically closest to the Warriors, and Warriors fans have had trouble with this for years because of their spending issues. The way that this works, if you can sign and trade your own players, assuming everybody's on board, there are no consequences to your team structure like that. You can create a trade exception. You can do anything else. What triggers the difficulty is bringing in a player via sign and trade. And so if you bring in a player via sign and trade, then you are subject to what's called the hard cap. And so with the hard cap, the basic idea behind it is the NBA wanted, and this is owners and players negotiating, they wanted teams that are really spending a lot of money, teams that are deep into the tax, to not have the same tools that everybody else does. They get a smaller mid-level exception. They get all these other things. And so the way that they enforce that is by, if you use one of those tools, like using the full mid-level or acquiring a player via sign and trade, you can't go too far into the tax. And so the hard cap for the NBA, it changes year by year, but it's roughly $6 million over the tax. But an important consideration there for the Lakers and any other team is that the difference between the hard cap and everything else is that it's the maximum amount under any circumstance. So that means if you have a player who has a $2 million unlikely bonus, so there's a half of a 1% chance that this guy makes the All-Star team, but he has that bonus anyway because then the agent, when they sign the contract, could say, see, it's worth $80 million instead of worth 78.
Right.
Those count for the hard cap. So there could be circumstances, and I don't know the nuances. Fortunately, LeBron and Anthony Davis probably have basically none of those. Because
Danny, most people don't know this, but Kentavious Caldwell-Pope gets $1.5 million if he's named ambassador to Denmark.
There we go.
Very unusual contract stipulation, so that would count.
Yeah, that would count. And so that is a real challenge in certain circumstances. Incidentally, one of the big ones was Drew Holiday, who just one of those cashed with the Bucks when they won the championship. And so that could matter in certain circumstances. I know Schröder had some, so that mattered for the Lakers. That mattered for the Lakers last year. But so basically the only way the Lakers could trigger the hard cap would be acquiring a player via sign and trade, or theoretically, if they wanted to use the larger mid-level exception. I'm assuming that they probably won't be able to unless a lot of guys leave. But theoretically, let's say Dennis Schröder really wants to play somewhere else. And whether that team has cap space or they don't, the Lakers, they might need to send a small asset back, like a mediocre second-round pick or something like that. Then what they could do is theoretically, they could do that. They could create a trade exception that they could use then for somebody else over 12 months. You have 12 months to use a trade exception. And that wouldn't trigger anything for them. Like they could do that. They could do that with.
If they send guys out, Dennis Schröder, they could, they theoretically, you could sign and trade Alex Caruso. You could sign and trade THT, Talen Horton-Tucker. You can do that kind of stuff without sort of triggering really restricting yourself in ways the Lakers from a practical standpoint can't.
Exactly. One modification there. The only reason that it could be relevant is that you have to be able to sign the player to that contract. So the big one there is Montrezl Harrell. So the Lakers only have what are called non-bird rights on him. So if Harrell signed for more of a raise than the Lakers could give him, then you can't get that benefit, because that's like having your cake and eating it too. Like you can't sign a guy to a contract and then trade, for a contract that you weren't allowed to sign it to.
But the minute if Harrell were to opt in, which he might, because the market for him is dicey, I would say potentially, the minute he opts in, the Lakers could, because I don't think he wants to be here. He doesn't really present a vibe of like, I want to be a Laker for life. That's just me talking.
Well, in fairness, he might want to be a Laker for life with a different coach.
Right.
Okay. If they were willing to replace
or knowing that he had a starting spot or something else.
Yeah. Something, whatever that might be. the second he opts in, the Lakers he could opt in with the understanding that the Lakers would then trade him. That's allowed, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so the reason Harrell might not do that is just it limits his flexibility, because then the Lakers have complete control. They could say, we want to do you a solid. It could be a circumstance of maybe you can't get that kind of money and you're going to sacrifice some latitude. But yeah, I mean, that is, so basically he would then function just like anybody else, like Kyle Kuzma or like Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. And you can trade that player without their consent. Now you can obviously want to do right by them, and you could do all that. And that could maybe, it's like a sort of like, it is legal, but it like an inducement, basically, I can do that. And for the Lakers, the real challenge with Montrezl Harrell then in that circumstance is then what is something that is acceptable for all parties, kind of that sense. So does, if they want to trade Harrell to a team with cap space, then that team with cap space is going to want to have used $9.7 million of that on Montrezl Harrell. If it's to a team that doesn't have cap space, then you're going to need to have matching salary come back unless they have an exception. And then that creates a different challenge. But that's why general managers make big money. That's why they need to do it, is that you want to have all of your ducks as much in a row as you can, though it's silly season and weird stuff happens all the time.
Yeah. It's why Rob Pelinka learned how to do this with his hands.
Yes.
All right. So you talk about, actually you get into some of this on the latest episode of the Dunked On podcast. And so let's next, you mentioned Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. You mentioned Kyle Kuzma. We talked about Trez. We're really interested in the value, because I'm terrible at this game. Like, how much is this guy worth? What could he bring back? Would love to get some of your opinions on the assets that the Lakers actually do have, and practically speaking, what they might bring back. We'll do that next.
Locked On Lakers brought to you by rockauto.com. With the ever-increasing numbers of makes and models out there, it's impossible to stock all the parts you need in a traditional chain storefront. And why would you pay 30%, 50%, 100% more for the exact same auto parts in a chain store or new dealership anyway? We can get them for far less at rockauto.com. Rockauto.com always offers the lowest prices possible, rather than changing the prices based on the market like the airlines do. Do not, Danny, get me started on the airlines. They are
You
out
should
of
walk.
control.
I don't know how often you fly, but you really should walk.
It's an absolute racket, unless the airlines want to sponsor this podcast.
In which case they're great.
They're a wonderful business. We owe a great debt of
We'll
gratitude.
take it to the trains at that point. Those guys suck. Don't get
rockauto.com, family business. They've been serving auto part customers online for 20 years. Everything you need in a few easy clicks delivered directly to your door. Go to rockauto.com right now. See all the parts available for your car or your truck, right locked on in the How Did You Hear Us box, so they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com.
One of the fundamental things, Danny, in silly season is the ability for Lakers fans to inflate the value of their assets, of the team's assets. It's our specialty. It's what we do around here. But the Lakers really did give away most of their valuable stuff in the Anthony trade, almost all of their draft capital that they control, and so on and so forth. They control 2021 this year, and then don't really control another pick, I don't think, until like 2027. So that leaves guys KCP, it leaves Kyle Kuzma, it leaves a sign-in traded Dennis Schröder, potentially the same with THT and Alex Caruso. What is the value of some of these guys around the league? Who has value, who doesn't, do you think?
The Lakers guys are actually an unusual challenge in that respect, because they have a lot of eye of the beholder players. And so Kentavious Caldwell-Pope is probably the single best example of that, where KCP, not a huge role within the offense, but he generally makes the shots you ask of him, and he plays hard on defense. And so some teams really want to have a guy like that. And KCP going to make $13 million this coming year, and then he has a partially guaranteed $14 million for the year after. I would say for teams that like him, that need somebody like KCP, it's probably close to neutral value. I don't think it's positive. That's solid. That's like low end starter money. I think KCP is a low end starter, and that's completely reasonable. Kuzma is hard because talented player, arguably in a very difficult situation to really spread his wings, and making $13 million this year, next year, and then as a player option for the year after. And player options are always challenging for when you're selling general managers, because the assumption is the player is going to make the right decision. So if that's too much money for the player, then he'll opt in, and then you have to pay him. And if it's too little money, then he'll opt out and become an unrestricted free agent. So I I think of Kuzma, like I think of him as at this point as a high-end reserve that could reestablish himself as a starter, but he's not quite there yet. So I would say he's slightly underwater, but I wouldn't be surprised if other GMs disagree. If somebody has him a little higher, that they think Kuzma's had real struggles with the Lakers, but it's a different circumstance. And so if we, give him the ball a little bit more, we put him in a situation where he can get it, maybe he can find his stroke back and he can get the offensive verve. I mean, Kuzma, I remember watching him in Summer League that first year. I hadn't watched any of him at Utah. I'm just like, wow, this guy's really talented. This guy's really skilled. And the Lakers haven't needed him to do as much. And that can be a challenge for a guy who's in his 20s and just, trying to find his way. And as much as LeBron makes life easier on his teammates, it also kind of narrows their role. And for some guys, that's great. I think that's been great for KCP. And for some guys, I think it's a little bit challenging. And I think that Kuzma is more in the second camp. So the challenge, though, for the Lakers, and you got at this with the draft pick part of it, is that most really desirable players are positive values on their contract. Now, there are some, maybe it's because their contract's too long or it's too rich, that it gets a little bit fraught. But the Lakers don't have a lot of clear-cut positive, okay, this is a really good sweetener. That's one way of putting it. And so, and that makes sense. Their centerpieces all went to New Orleans for Anthony Davis, and they have a championship to show for it. I don't think they regret it one bit. And, they would have been firmly in the mix this year had they been healthy. So I think that getting a lot better this year from that respect will be difficult, but managing a few things on the periphery and, figuring out, okay, this is the type of team we want to be, getting the right pieces around him. That's really all the Lakers need to be a championship contender, if not the championship favorite, because they have two of the 5-6 best players in the league. Pretty easy to make it a case for them that way.
Schröder and the Lakers, I think, are in a fascinating position right now with each other, because I think both of them might be open to not being with each other moving forward, but they may be kind of stuck with each other between what the Lakers surrendered to give up, to bring in Schröder in that deal, and then Schröder reportedly turning down an extension that could possibly
and as you noted, Danny, too, the inability for the Lakers to really replace Schröder with a similar caliber player.
And then Schröder reportedly turning down an extension that may end up above his perceived market value. Specifically that, though, what do you think his market value would be, Danny? But also, do you think he's seen around the league as a quality starter? And I ask that not just because it's been like a debate between Brian and I over the course of this whole season. I think he is more of a high-end reserve than somebody you'd want to start. But also, too, I think it's important because this will have to do with how teams peg him for the league and, in turn, the type of money that he could get and leverage against the Lakers.
It's a great question, and I will admit that my own calibration is not necessarily in line because it's been that way since he was in Oklahoma City and since it was with Lakers. My stance on Schröder personally, as an analyst, but we'll get into the other stuff in a second, is that the main thing you want a point guard to be able to do is to be able to create reliable offense for themselves and others. I think that is the basic goal, unless you have somebody bigger or different position who can do it. LeBron James, James Harden, if you think Ben Simmons can do that, Ben Simmons, that sort of guy. And with Schröder, generally speaking, I think he fails that test. I think you look at the Lakers, the offense without LeBron, OKC, when he played without Chris Paul, generally struggled offensively. And Schröder I think he can do well in other roles, in other boxes, but that's generally not the type of player that you give a lot of money to. And the problem for why I think I am outside of at least part of the norm on this is that Schröder has put up box score stats. He's gotten, credit for a lot of the things that have gone well in other situations. And it really only takes one or two front offices feeling more optimistic than I do to really drive that up. So I would say if Schröder is a high-end, if he is seen as a high-end reserve, more in the line that I do, I would be thinking of Schröder more as a $10 to $12 million a year player. However, it only takes one or two, probably two teams to think he's a starter to bump that to 18 or 19. That's how stark the difference can be.
Who's going to give him that money, though? That's the thing that I look around the league and I cannot figure out where he gets that money.
Right. And so, if we start out with I think this is a good quick exercise to do of the teams that have 20 million or more in space and think about, would they be interested in Schröder? Charlotte, probably not, possibly. No. I mean, depending on how, I wouldn't expect it. Chicago, maybe, but I think they could have other priorities. Dallas, no. I think they would go in other directions. Memphis, no, they have Ja. Miami, I mean, they have other guys that would be higher, maybe as a fallback.
Schroeder does not strike me as a Miami culture kind of guy.
No, I agree. But they've been able to, fit some square pegs in the round hole there before, which has actually worked out pretty well.
What's German for square peg? Because
I wish I knew.
What about fitting like an octagon? This feels more like fitting an octagon.
And there's no hole. You just have to jam it through whatever surface that you're trying to use.
And then so from that point, there are only 4 more teams that have this level of cap space. The Knicks, maybe. Thunder, no, especially after they got Kemba Walker. Maybe they trade Kemba, but they already have Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. Spurs, probably not. They have 1 billion guards already. And then Toronto, nobody knows what in the world they're doing, but probably not.
I could see the Knicks, maybe.
Yeah, I could see the Knicks, maybe. I mean, Leon Rose has generally done a good job, but I could see... I mean, they need somebody who could juice the offense a little bit. And if they want somebody who can play on and off ball next to Randall and RJ, it's possible. But so you look at that list and you're like, okay, there are a couple that are plausible, but if a lot of those teams, you brought up the Knicks, like if they could get their hands on somebody like Conley or Lowry, maybe even Spencer Dinwiddie, depending on how they feel about his ACL, I think they'd be higher. So Schroeder could be in a really difficult spot. And then the other option, we already talked a little bit about signing trades, is that another team that doesn't have spending power could be interested in Schroeder, and then they'd have to send back some matching salary, which could either go to the Lakers or a third team. That's possible, but I don't see a clear-cut real team there either. So that could lead itself to the situation that you brought up of like basically these sides being kind of tethered to each other, at least for the time being. And the challenge to some extent there is, creating mutually acceptable terms. But you think about what that would be for the Lakers. Part of the goal there would be, I used to call this something different, but it seemed a little bit callous. So now it's called the human trade exception, where basically the idea is, in his case, it would be a longer contract because I don't think Schroeder wants a 1-year deal. Maybe he does. We'll see. But basically the idea being that if you could, as the Lakers, one of your goals could be sign Dennis Schroeder to a contract that is manageable enough that 6 months from now, another team would be interested. Mm-hmm. And so at that point, then you can get back into silly season, because if you let Schroeder go, then you basically lose that salary slot. And that was actually a part of the theory that people had with the Warriors and D'Angelo Russell back when they got him, is they're like, well, if we let Kevin Durant go, then it's very hard for us to add a player worth 20 to 30 million. They ended up with Andrew Wiggins. We'll see how that works out. But so that could be a theory for the Lakers, assuming the Buss family is willing to pay it, that you do that. You hope that his value stays level or above, you hope that it can be positive, and you get a good player who can help you. Even if Schroeder is imperfect, he's still better than,
he's still good.
Nothing.
Yeah. And that's
exactly.
This is what I think is really fascinating about this, because you watch Laker, you hear, I'm sure you hear from Laker fans on Twitter, you people send questions.
Never. Lakers fans are very, they don't respond at all.
Very demure. They're the Canada of fans. They're sending questions into you and Nate. They're doing all kinds of stuff for your mailbag, but and they don't like Schroeder because he had some very high profile failings in the playoffs, and short as they were. What is the gap though between the quality player of Schroeder, and like John Hollinger, your colleague at The Athletic, has a really great series of columns out that will keep growing as we get closer to free agency, that kind of approximates the potential value of free agents that are out there. He pegs Schroeder, to your point, at about $11.5 million.
Yep.
If you don't sign him, the Lakers really only have that, mid-level, that's the smaller mid-level, setting aside for a second whether or not you'd want to have to use it on a guard that you just let go to replace that spot. What level player could they get? Are you left with Raul Neto? Could you get Cam Payne? I mean, are you stuck with Lou Williams? Like what could you get for that $5 million if that's what you wanted to spend it on?
So just as a point, Cordy, there would be an outside shot that the Lakers could use the $9.5 million non-taxpayer mid-level. Mm-hmm. It would just depend on a few other things. So Schroeder going out, that opens up some spending power, but not a ton. But probably it's going to be the 5.9. And one of the other consequences that if you want to use that on a point guard is that means you can't use it on anything else. It's not something that can mitosis or meiosis and just grow into two. And then all of a sudden, I mean, the Lakers would try to argue this.
It's suboptimal, to say the least.
It is. And so I think you're probably now a player could take less because the Lakers would be offering something great. They'd be offering potentially a starting and closing role on a title contender. So maybe then you can get into the Derrick Rose, George Hill, Goran Dragic, Patty Mills group. But I think you're more campaign, maybe Reggie Jackson. I think you're probably in that kind of a range. Neto, I think of more as a.
I think that would be very disappointing to Reggie Jackson.
I agree. I think Jackson could get 10 mil, but maybe he'd rather be on, be starting on the Lakers like that, or starting and closing. Like that's a pretty good gig. But I think this is the time for Jackson to cash in. Might even be the co-tenants at Staples for the time being. I would think so as well. And so, but you're probably looking, maybe I would say like campaign George Hill, probably something in that vein. I actually think, George Hill, he's imperfect, but I like that he can defend and he can shoot threes. I mean, he did incredibly well at the Bucks 2 years ago. But as I mentioned, tying up the mid-level exception with that means that all of the other avenues that the Lakers could improve, they're basically left to minimum contracts. And that isn't great. I mean, the Lakers can do better with minimum contracts than basically any other team in the league, because in certain cases they can offer playing time, and in certain cases they can offer the prestige of playing for a glamour franchise that's competing for championships. Like a minimum contract at the Lakers is better than almost anywhere else, but it's still a minimum contract. So if you're offering a $5 million player $2 million, sometimes they'll take it. Sometimes they'll say, hey, that's $3 million less.
Well, on the other hand, if you listen to our show for Wednesday, as you know, we believe that LeBron could, like Chris Paul could sign for a minimum, and LeBron could just give him $60 or $70 million and don't tell anyone. He's that rich.
I will note very briefly that is circumvention, and the league now, there are allegations.
Are you sure? Like, have you actually seen that written down? Like, you're not allowed to do that?
Oh, by the way, I need to correct myself really quickly on this, Brian. I'm glad you brought this up. When we were talking about this scheme, we noted that Chris Paul, he'll have to resign as president of the Players Association, because you can't, as the president, take that far below your market value. Like, it sets a bad precedent around the league.
I mean, there was that idea of like Chris Paul opting out and taking the mid-level. And it was like, even if Chris Paul, even if that's what he wants to do, and at 36, he has earned the right to do whatever he wants. I agree with you. He would have to step down to the Players Association.
But what I had incorrect, though, and again, I want to correct myself. We care a lot about accuracy when coming up with these schemes. I had said that LeBron James would have to resign as vice president of the Players Association, because as somebody holding that status, he would or should object to Chris doing that as well. It turns out LeBron is no longer VP of the Players Association.
He gave that up a couple years ago.
Right.
Done.
So it's even easier now. Like there's one layer of complication that's now gone.
Like Chris Paul can't do that. Could he theoretically have a clause in a shoe contract that says if you play for the Lakers, you make an extra $10 million? I believe that is not circumvention. So there are ways to scheme this and make it legal. Not that I need to draw the ire of 29 other families telling the Lakers how to scheme.
My current plan has LeBron and Chris Paul opening a car wash together.
Or and
you could also do the math from there.
You could also hire Cliff Paul as a consultant, or maybe make it so that a different insurance company gives him $25 million a year. Maybe that would be.
Can you put in your contract that if you sign with the Lakers, you get an extra $60 million from Spring Hill Entertainment? Like, is that allowable?
Spring Hill. So I would be. This is actually something I would actually love to ask.
The best use of a cap expert ever
is if, but still, like, it is different if it's something that's connected with a player. Like, I would be very interested in like actually asking, somebody in the office because it's kind of like an advisory ruling for the Supreme Court, where it's like, what would you do in this circumstance? Right. But yeah, I mean. So let's get to Alex Caruso's bird rights, because that's significantly more fun than talking about how much they can pay Chris Paul.
Look, I mean, it was fundamental to the script of Space Jam: A New Legacy 2 that all play the lead, and his quote is $90 million. We had no idea. It is what it is. You mentioned THT and Alex Caruso right there, and you also said something about the attraction, the lure of minimum deals that I want to ask you about as well, because I do wonder if next year especially that might be slightly less true than it typically would be. We'll do all that next.
Locked On Lakers brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline, the fastest, easiest way to bet on all your sports action. Baseball season's in full swing. You can track all the action at BetOnline. This week, as always, tons of sports action on the go, including MLB, UFC, MMA. Before the next pitch, head over to BetOnline on your laptop, your mobile device. Check out all the great sporting news, sign-up bonuses, contest information. Don't sit on the sidelines anymore. This is your chance to get into the game. Head to the website, use your mobile device, sign up today, receive your 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit using the promo code LOCKEDON. BetOnline, your online sportsbook experts.
Danny, it must be very exciting for you to be on a show with such innovative, out-of-the-box thinkers as ourselves.
Hey, it's a fun experience. And honestly, you think at the various times that I've done, different pieces, getting asked basic questions can sometimes lead you to really interesting things. I mean, I think back to my friend Andy Leroux, who writes for various different places.
Oh, we love Andy.
Yeah. So Andy I give him credit. He's the first person to ask me, so how could, actually the mechanics of how could the Warriors sign Kevin Durant? And I was like, oh, I should turn that into a piece, and then turned it into a piece, and then two pieces, and then everything else that happened. Not saying I'm the reason it happened. I'm certainly not. But it's very important to to understand what level you need to get to. And the Lakers are actually a great, as they have been at other times. I used Jordan Clarkson years ago to explain the Gilbert Arenas rule.
Yeah.
And there are a bunch of other, they've actually been at the forefront, and LeBron James individually has been at the forefront. A lot of those types of ways to explain things in terms that are more accessible, because I understand that this stuff is difficult. That's part of why I have a job.
Well, you're welcome then. Andy, go ahead.
And part of why we have a job is to come up with absolutely ridiculous scenarios to bring Chris Paul under the table to the Lakers. You mentioned Alex Caruso. What do you see? He's really interesting in terms of the market value for a guy who's a borderline specialist, with defense. And I also think, and correct me if you disagree, that he's most useful on a high-end team. He's a little too old, doesn't really have the upside that would make sense for a rebuilding team or even a low-end contender. But in the right scenario, which includes, by the way, the Lakers, I think he's really, really valuable.
I agree, but generally speaking, you calibrate it based on how many teams would really want to have this player. And with Caruso, I brought up earlier with Schröder that the most important thing a point guard size guy can do is create offense for himself and others. Caruso is not great at that. He is good at many other things, and that's part of why he's useful to the Lakers. So if I had to guess, so there's the smaller, the taxpayer mid-level is $5.9 million. And then there's the larger 9.5. I like that they're reciprocals this year. It's kind of nice. And the 5.9, 9.5. And that's for teams that are over the cap, but not deep into the tax. You could think of there are various squads in that situation this year. I think it's very possible that there are offers for Caruso around that 5.9 million. But I don't think that there are a ton at that 9.5. That's a lot of money. Ooh. That means, there aren't going to be that many. There aren't that many teams this year that are going to use the 9.5 because the cap isn't going up that much.
Right.
And so there just isn't that much spending power. So I think Caruso, in that $5 to $7, $8 million range is there. But the nice thing for the Lakers is that they have what are called full bird rights on Caruso. And what that means is the Lakers can sign Caruso to any amount based technically between his minimum and his maximum, and it's allowed. They don't have to use any other exception. It's just bird rights. And so that theoretically would allow them to sign and trade him if they wanted, but it's also to retain Caruso for their own uses. So that means that if both sides want to come back, all they have to do is negotiate terms. There are no other hurdles to jump through, unlike some other players, like bringing in new guys, for example.
Right. With THT, there was some talk at the beginning of the year that teams, because he was playing so well and was kind of, and all that, might do the poison pill thing at the end of his deal to make it very difficult for the Lakers to sign him. And so his play, while very exciting for a 20-year-old second-round pick, did level off a little bit to the point where it's hard for me to picture somebody offering him $20 million plus in year 3 and 4 of a contract. But what do you think his market value might be? Because ideally, from a roster standpoint, the Lakers really need to bring back both THT and Caruso and probably Schröder, based on what we were talking about before.
I heard some of that chatter as well. And the way, just to get out there in 1 minute or less, the way that would work is the contract can't go above that higher mid-level exception for 2 years, and then it could theoretically go all the way to his maximum. That's what happened with Omer Asik. That's what happened with Jeremy Lin in the same offseason, and it hasn't really happened since. And there actually is a new tool. They changed this a couple of years ago. Theoretically, were the Lakers to have to deal with that kind of an offer sheet and want to match it, they can choose between having the salary, go that, 9 million, then up to 20 or whatever, doing it that way, or they could choose to average it. It'd be interesting to see what they would do. They basically did that so the teams wouldn't get completely worked by kind of other teams' financial structures. But I don't think that's going to matter too much with Horton-Tucker. I like him. I think that he can defend. I'm intrigued by what he can do with the ball in his hands. But I mean, the idea that he could get, let's say, like an average of $15 million a year, I think that would be a team saying he's definitely a starter right now. And right. Instead of he could be. And I think that's what could lead to Horton-Tucker getting something more in the $7 to $9 million range. Like, that's the fun thing, the difference between THT and Caruso. Like, Caruso was more valuable to the Lakers last year. He helped them win significantly, obviously more in the 2020 championship season. But Caruso's, I believe, 27, Horton-Tucker's 20. And it's, the mystery box of this guy. Maybe in the next 3 years, he can work on his jump shot. And then if he can do that and he can play a little bit on ball, play a little bit off ball and defend, can do that. So I wouldn't be stunned to see a team dip into the richer, right, the non-taxpayer mid-level.
Because he's got more potential value to another team that can give him 25 minutes a night next year in ways the Lakers may not be able to.
Right. And there aren't that many players that are young and at around that level. So you can think about former Laker Josh Hart. I like Josh Hart a lot, former MVP of Summer League. He's 26. So would a team be more interested in a more raw player who's 20 or a 26-year-old who also hasn't proven himself to be a starter yet, just mostly opportunity? So like THT, I think there is an argument there for him. And the restricted class is very weird because there are a couple of guys that are going to get, significant money. John Collins and Duncan Robinson and potentially maybe Gary Trent Jr. and Jared Allen. But then that kind of like next tier down is actually pretty weak. And so, maybe some teams like Kendrick Nunn or Devontae Graham better, or Mitchell Robinson, depending on what happens with his option. So I could see Horton-Tucker being kind of the belle of that ball, mm-hmm, and getting that kind of money. But having a team with cap space, like we've already brought up that list, it's like 8 teams that do it, to really make this difficult, I don't see it. It's possible, it's plausible, but I don't think it's likely.
My last thing for you, Danny, is about that minimums thing, because that is always the idea that the Lakers, especially a Lakers team with LeBron, AD, obviously a clear title contender. I think the odds came out on Wednesday about last year's championship. The Lakers and the Nets are right at the top of that, and I think that makes sense. Given how many, I am wondering though, given how many teams can legitimately next year thinking, you know what, we got a shot, like a real shot at this. There could be a lot of places where guys could look at it and say, I could go win a title there. I could go win a title there. And some of them are some attractive places to play. How concerned do you think the Lakers ought to be that some of those targets, which may be easier to get in a typical year, might be harder to get this year at a minimum?
They should be concerned for those reasons, but also because there aren't that many free agents that are like really good this year. And so like there's been a weird culling of kind of supply and demand because all those players, including AD, who signed extensions. And so what that's led to is there isn't that much money out there, but there also are not that many players worth it. So maybe it's a player is considering the mid-level exception versus the minimum. And that's tough, whether we're at the 5.9 million, like let's say somebody like Nicolas Batum. Like if Nicolas Batum were on the table and he can look at 5.9 million with another team versus a minimum with Lakers, let's say they have to use the MLE on a point guard or something. Like that's hard. And the Lakers are in that mix. I think what it's really going to come down to, you brought up the like championship contender. That is a consideration. Also, market size, team prestige, those matter too. But the thing that the Lakers for certain positions can offer is playing time. And so if you are this is the idea with Wes Matthews. This is the idea with, kind of, to me, I would actually say that works for a forward size guy, unless for whatever reason they don't have a point guard, in which case, yeah, you could make that argument. And so if you're, as the Lakers, going to somebody and saying, your choice is between being our 6th or 7th man and being the 4th forward on the Nets, well, maybe that's different. But if you play a different position, like the Nets have the guard line pretty well settled with all their dudes. I think that you're going after different players. You're making a different sales pitch. But I agree with you that it could be difficult. The other thing that might end up kind of going in the Lakers' favor, though, is this is going to be a very weird market. And I think we could see some players that say next year, there's going to probably be more optimism. There's going to almost definitely be a lot more money around the league. I'd rather, this was kind of in some ways the theory that Montrezl Harrell used. We'll see if it works out. Of this is a place to stabilize or rebuild my value, and have a good time while I'm doing it. Try to do in a certain way like what Rajon Rondo did last year, 2 years ago now, I guess. And that might happen. It might not. And I think that relying on the minimum, unless they have very good intel for some sort of reason that something's going to come through in the clutch for them, I think that it is something that you need to think about. And the other challenge, and this is actually, I think what you guys are getting at is a really interesting question, is the buyout market. Because there will be more players that become free agents later on. And that, at that point you're going to be competing, but the whole game board is going to be shuffled up a little bit. So teams will have injuries and everything else.
Danny, thank you so much for being able to come on and explain how the Lakers are going to get Kyle Lowry and Mike Conley under the cap. I didn't think it was possible. And still that sign and trade for DeRozan, Andy. That was
you got to read between the lines of what Danny's saying.
That's what I took away from
once you really get in tune with it, it's all pretty obvious.
This was a lot of fun and super informative.
I apologize for ruining all your credibility, Dan.
Oh, don't worry about it. It's already ruined.
He is Danny Leroux, salary cap and NBA expert at The Athletic. His stuff is great. You should make it there. Listen to him on the Dunked On podcast with Nate Duncan and Real GM Radio, both podcasts worth your time. Thanks so much for coming on, man. We really appreciate it. It's great to meet you. I don't think we've ever actually met before.
Yeah, maybe that'll happen at some point sooner. But yeah.
Be nice. Definitely be nice. Thank you, man.